just getting this video out to you as early as possible. I know it's early for all of y'all. It feels like because y'all like to sleep in until noon. But so we are going to finish this up today in this video. So let's just get into it. Let me zoom in a little bit. Not that much. Okay. So this is about troops and excuse me. It is July. Excuse me again. July 1965, and you are still President Lyndon B. Johnson. You have not changed. The U.S. has about 2,300 military advisors in Vietnam with the help of the Vietnamese army fight the communists. However, the Vietnamese are losing to the Viet Cong, and your commander in Vietnam has called for the U.S. to send in 100,000 combat troops. Polls repeatedly show that a majority of Americans support a stronger U.S. military role in Vietnam. You've called a meeting to decide whether to send large numbers of troops to Vietnam. Here are some arguments your advisors have made regarding this important decision. So, if the U.S. does not take a strong stand against the communists in Vietnam now, it will be like when the Europeans failed to take a strong stance against Hitler in the 1930s. They're thinking this is going to be appeasement, that we're just appeasing the communist powers that be, and if the communists wins, other countries in Southeast Asia will fall like dominoes to communism. This is the domino theory, that Eisenhower kind of was like, this is what's going to happen. Communist China will expand its influence in the region and may even take over some countries. And they're thinking this is just going to be Hitler 2.0, but with Mao. In the Korean War, the U.S. stood up to the communist aggression by North Korea, which China and the Soviet Union backed in its attempt to conquer South Korea. The U.S. should also stand up against the communists again in Vietnam. And so they're thinking this will just be Korea 2.0, and we will be victorious, or at least stop the spread of communism. One advisor says that the situation in Korea differed from the one in Vietnam. The Korean War involved conventional warfare, whereas in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare is taking place. So guerrilla warfare is just like sneak attacks. It's not like, hey, I'm gonna meet you here. You're gonna be over there. We're gonna fight. There's no pitched battles really. Also, the terrain or the geography and the political situation in Vietnam is very different, and makes this war fundamentally, like, just at its basic core, than the war in Korea. The French fought the Vietnamese for 7 years with a large army and couldn't defeat them. The U.S. may not be able to defeat the Viet Cong without suffering unacceptable losses. Two advisors feel that the present situation differs from the French face in Vietnam. The French army used defensive tactics, so waiting for the attack, that gave the initiative to the communists. The and the war lacked public support in France. In contrast, so unlike in France, the U.S. will take the initiative militarily, and the U.S. public currently supports the U.S. military action in Vietnam. One general estimates it would take 500,000 troops 5 years to win the war. One advisor tells you the integrity of the U.S. commitment is the principal pillar of peace throughout the world. If that con- um, commitment becomes unreliable, the communist world would draw conclusions that would lead to our ruin and almost certainly to a catastrophic war. So, this is essentially saying if we let the communists win here and we pull out and we go against our promises that we've made, that we will protect countries against the evils of communism, communists would be like, okay, they're no longer the superpower that they are, and we can just run roughshod over them, and it just completely wins. A senator who is a close advisor to you says that Vietnam has no strategic, economic, or tactical value and that the U.S. can never win there. Sending troops there would hurt the U.S. and help the communists, since the jungles of Vietnam are a terrible place to fight a war. The last one is kind of just like, hey, why are we here? Like, we don't, as Muhammad Ali, it's like, I have no quarrel with the Viet Cong. Like, don't. It's like, why are we over there? It's like we don't need to be over there. And so then, will you approve sending large numbers of American combat troops into Vietnam? And you can ask two questions. Again, ask two questions and answer why did you do those two questions? So one, how popular is the Vietnamese government? Two, what is the military situation in South Vietnam? How strong are the two sides? What do leading experts say about the stability and the popularity of the South Vietnamese government? And number four, can the U.S. get advice from political scientists about the difficult situation like this? So this 4 questions, pick 2 questions, ask why. So answers to some of these questions. How popular is the South Vietnamese government? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara says that the Viet Cong control more of the countryside than the South Vietnamese government does. Landowners, Catholics, and some other people in the cities support the South Vietnamese government. Landless peasants and renters, about 70% of the population, generally don't support the government because the government supports landowners. The Viet Cong let the peasants own land, but the current government does not. So you have this difference. Since much of its support comes from large landowners who make money renting their land to peasants. Buddhists don't like the government because it's closely linked to the Catholic Church. Many South Vietnamese don't like the government because it's corrupt and because many of its leaders work for the French when Vietnam was a French colony. In addition, some South Vietnamese oppose the government because the Viet Cong has terrorized them through assassination, through threats, into doing so. So it's not a great thing. Also, B, American military officers conduct a study known as PROVN, P-R-O-V-N, based on interviews with returning U.S. officers in which they discussed their travels to the countryside of South Vietnam. And the study concluded that A, the number one issue for many villagers is security. The Viet Cong provide a higher level of security than the South Vietnamese government. B, most villagers believe that the South Vietnamese government doesn't care about their welfare and they view government officials as arrogant. Most officials don't come from villages, so they have little understanding of or sympathy for the villagers. And C, the Viet Cong, also known as the NLF, the National Liberation Front, seem to care about the villagers and help them with their problems. For example, the NLF members live in the villages in order to help them with farm work such as planting and harvesting. So that is going on. So essentially, it's like the role of government is to help its people. And right now, the Viet Cong are helping the people more than the South Vietnamese government. And so a lot of people in South Vietnam are like, hey, we support the Viet Cong more so than our government. C, from a former military officer in the Viet Cong, and the date of this is unknown. I was poor. I had lost my land. I didn't have enough money to take care of my children. In 61, propaganda cadres of the front, the NLF or the Viet Cong contacted me. They came to all the poor farmers and made an analysis of the poor and rich classes. They said that the rich people had always served the French and had used the authority of the French to oppress the poor. Without any other means to live, the poor had become slaves to the landowner. The cadres told us that if the poor people don't stand up to the rich people, we would be dominated by them forever. The only way to ensure freedom and a sufficient life was to overthrow them. When I heard the cadres, I thought that what they said was correct. I knew that the rich oppressed the poor in our village, so I joined the Liberation Front. I followed the Viet Cong, to fight for freedom and prosperity for the country. I felt this was right. The founder of the Viet Cong, kind of said, in the countryside, the DM, former president of South Vietnam, destroyed at a blow the dignity and livelihood of several 100,000 peasants by canceling the land redistribution arrangements. So, like, hey, taking land and like giving it out to the people instead of having one guy own all the land. That's what that kind of means. Instituted by the Viet Minh in the areas they controlled prior to 1954. He might have attempted to use American aid to compensate owners and capitalize on peasant goodwill. Instead, he courted the large landowners, farmers who had been working land they considered their own often for years, now faced demands for back rent and exorbitant new rates. Exorbitant means very high. It was an economic disaster for them. The result of all of this was a frustrated and indignant peasantry, fertile ground for an anti-DM agitation. So, against the government. In 1964, the village chief of Duc Lap told an American researcher that about 70% of the villagers support the NLF, about 30 were neutral, and about 1% openly supported the South Vietnamese government. From a television broadcast, the survey of attitudes of the people of South Vietnam is the subject of this broadcast. The overwhelming desire for peace permeates or goes through our findings. Asked what they would choose if they could be given 3 wishes for their country. 4 out of 5 named peace as their first choice. Another indication of the indifferences between unity of purpose and disagreement over method is found toward the Viet Cong. In the secure areas of South Vietnam where the interviews took place, there was an intense dislike for the Viet Cong. As we shall see later in detail, the people blamed the VC, the Viet Cong, more than anyone else for the continuation of the war. They find little to like and much to dislike about the Viet Cong, and when asked whether they think life would be easier in their district under the Viet Cong or nationalist control, nobody, not 1 in 1,500, feels they'd be better off under the Viet Cong. Despite this, 46% of the people feel we should stop bombing and burning hamlets in the South, even though they are suspected of harboring Viet Cong. Nevertheless, almost as many as 37% feel we should continue to bomb and burn where Viet Cong are hiding. It becomes clear from a study of the data that South Vietnam has its own distinct set of hawks and doves. Which hawks and doves are? Hawks are people who are pro-war, doves being pro-peace. In general, the people indicate approval of Americans as people. In general, the people of Vietnam indicate approval of Americans as people. In the countryside, our medical and food assistance and our sweeps to make areas secure were mentioned in a favorable light, but in the cities, our image suffers from the usual problems our soldiers on the town. Nevertheless, even in the cities, the majority sentiment expressed is pro-American. So the people in Vietnam are pro-American troops being there. The Vietnamese view their own government in Saigon with a mixture of approval and suspicion. Throughout the survey, two undercurrents are in constant evidence. One is a desire for peace, the other for economic improvement, more and better jobs, lower prices, lower taxes, better business conditions. Peace and economic well being, of course, are closely related. And it is fair to say that yearning for peace are motivated as much prepare by a desire for a decent life as an escape from the miseries of war. So these people, it's like, we just want better jobs, things to be cheaper. We don't want to pay a lot of taxes. We want better business conditions to do business. And then we want peace and economic well being. That's all we want. And the thing is, we're just tired of this war. And so, question 2, I know that was a long question. What is the military situation in South Vietnam? How strong are the two sides? The South Vietnamese army has about 500,000 troops, supported by about 23,000 U.S. troops. According to current intelligence, the Viet Cong have about 300,000 guerrilla fighters, supported by a few thousand North Vietnamese troops. The entire North Vietnamese army consists of about 500,000 troops. So North Vietnam can send many more troops to support the Viet Cong. Excuse me. According to military doctrine regarding guerrilla warfare, so like jungle warfare, like hiding, not dressing in the uniform, the U.S. forces would need to outnumber the Viet Cong by a ratio of 10 to 1 to ensure victory. So we need, for every one troop on the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong, 10 troops, which would mean approximately 3 million South Vietnamese and American troops. However, the U.S. has supplied the South Vietnamese with sophisticated weapons that make up the difference in numbers. In addition, American forces are highly trained and have great firepower, so the U.S. may not need to achieve a 10 to 1 ratio to defeat the Viet Cong. So they're saying, hey, we need 10 to 1 normally to win this type of war. But because we have better technology, we won't need the 10 to 1. On the other hand, morale runs low within the South Vietnamese army, while the Viet Cong appear to have high morale. So South Vietnam army, they're not feeling good about the situation as the Viet Cong. They're like, hey, we're feeling good. We could keep going. The Viet Cong have mentioned to capture larger and larger areas of the countryside, which indicates that they have taken the offensive. The CIA reports that the communists control more of the villages in South Vietnam than the South Vietnamese government does. That's a bad sign. As it says, a bad sign. And so this is just essentially saying, right now in South Vietnam, the government is not liked by these villagers. The Viet Cong are more liked than these people. And so number 3, what do leading experts say about the stability and popularity of the South Vietnamese government? So LBJ's political advisors, including Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam, tell you that the South Vietnamese government stands on the verge of collapse, possibly in the next 6 months. The government has enough military equipment, but it has a terrible political leadership. One coup or overthrow after another has taken place. Corruption also runs rampant within the South Vietnamese government. So these people are taking money, they're taking bribes, they're not really following the law, and they're not really keeping it. There's another problem. The U.S. has few experts on Vietnam. Most of the leading U.S. Department experts on Asia were fired during Senator McCarthy's anti-communist purge in the 1950s. So this communist purge that's going on, the communist purge from Senator McCarthy, or McCarthyism, if you remember, is like, hey, I don't like you, you're a communist. And so these people were ousted as communists, and so we don't really have a whole lot of experts. And since many people blame the U.S. State Department for failing to prevent China from falling to communism in 49, many of Senator McCarthy's anti-communist attacks targeted State Department experts on Asia. In general, the U.S. does not have a good understanding of the Vietnamese society. And our final questions kind of answer: can the U.S. get advice from a political scientist about the difficult situation like this? The answer, in short, yes. The political scientist advises that you focus on goals. What do you want to accomplish in Vietnam? Is Vietnam important to the national interests of the United States? Are your goals realistic? That is, does the U.S. have a responsible or reasonable chance of accomplishing these goals? Okay, let's look at this outcome. Let's see what President Johnson does, and I'm gonna back out a little bit. President Johnson, or actually in history, President Johnson and his advisors met every day for a week to discuss whether to send large numbers of U.S. troops to Vietnam. In the end, Johnson decided to send the troops. This proved to be a major turning point in the war, as the U.S. escalated its position from advisor. So instead of playing a kind of backseat role to the South Vietnamese government and army, to taking over the main combat role. So now we're going to send in troops directly fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. By January of 66, the U.S. had 186,000 troops in Vietnam, and by 68, so in 2 years, they had more than 500,000. The war did not go well for the U.S. More than 50,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were wounded as a result of the war. More than 1 million Vietnamese died in the war. Millions more were wounded, and still millions of others became refugees. So they fled the country in fears of getting killed. The Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare, attacking surreptitiously and then blending in after with civilians in the village. So they would do sneak attacks and surprise attacks. Therefore, it was very difficult to fight the Viet Cong without killing civilians. So, like, when you're dressed up like a normal person and you're not in a uniform, it's kind of hard to tell who's who. Naturally, the U.S. commander used air power to assist their troops. However, pilots found it difficult to distinguish Viet Cong positions from civilian encampments or villages. A congressional report estimated that the U.S. killed 2 civilians for every Viet Cong killed in the fighting. Civilian deaths led to more Vietnamese to hate the U.S., mainly consequently joined the Viet Cong, thus leading to this endless cycle of violence. In effect, the U.S. helped the Viet Cong recruit more guerrilla fighters. The Viet Cong also used terroristic tactics such as threats and assassinations to intimidate South Vietnam civilians into supporting them. North Vietnamese had an army of about 500,000 soldiers, but only a few thousand of these were in South Vietnam in 65. However, as the U.S. raised the number of troops it committed, the North Vietnamese countered by sending more of their troops into South Vietnam. The U.S. soldiers, frustrated by fighting guerrillas and by losing comrades to booby traps and ambushes, sometimes committed atrocities and killed civilians. The most well-known case became known as the My Lai massacre after the village in which it occurred. Lieutenant William Cayley, who led a platoon that killed hundreds of civilians in the village, was later convicted of a war crime. No one knows exactly how many atrocities U.S. soldiers committed during this war, but the mere fact that American soldiers killed civilians hurt the reputation of both the U.S. and its army. And then the war raised questions about the racial composition of American soldiers. Some African Americans felt they endured higher casualty rates than whites. other African Americans questioned why they should fight for the U.S. abroad when they were deprived the rights at home. Leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, we've talked about them in the past, an important civil rights group, stated their opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam and declared their support for draft resistors. So people not wanting to be drafted in the army. And declared their support for draft resistors. The civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael characterized the draft as nothing more than white people sending black people to make war on yellow people in order to defend the land they stole from red people. And so the war also raised questions about social class. Some critics claim that the war hit poor Americans especially hard. The wealthy received college deferments and desk jobs in the military, while the poor were twice as likely both to get drafted and to see combat. Fighting in Vietnam, especially after the troop escalated, cost a great deal of money. President Johnson either had to raise taxes or cut spending on his Great Society programs or deficit spending. So, deficit spending is spending more money than you have and borrowing what you can't make up. Johnson chose to deficit spend, which led to inflation, a major unintended consequence. So, inflation just making money worth less while raising prices of things. In addition, the war did eventually lead to cutbacks in the Great Society programs. So these were welfare programs, education reform, civil rights, all about his Great Society. It was kind of like the New Deal, but under Johnson. As the war dragged on, public opinion turned against it, especially as casualties increased. Many Americans had trouble understanding why the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam and losing so many young Americans. By 1968, President Johnson's approval rating had dropped to only at about 40%, which is like random because like our last couple of presidents, 40% is like, oh, that's okay, like that's pretty good. That's not great, but it's pretty good. The war had led to many protests at home. Some became angry with the protesters, criticizing them for not supporting their country in a time of war. The war not only divided the public, it also split the Democratic Party into a peace wing and a pro-war wing. Johnson decided not to run for re-election, and the internal division of the Democratic Party allowed the Republicans to win the presidency in 1968. The Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon ran a campaign based on law and order. This theme connected with many voters who saw the Vietnam protests as a symptom of the country falling into anarchy. Nixon's supporters felt people should obey the law and respect those in the military who risked their lives, and protester tactics such as flying Viet Cong flags or chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" shocked these voters. These protesters, meanwhile, felt that it was their duty as loyal Americans to oppose the government and question an immoral war that was hurting the country. As the U.S. soldiers returned home, they were generally ignored and sometimes criticized for the most part. The American public did not welcome them home as heroes. The war had become so divisive that many people did not want to do anything that reminded them of it, including parades and other ceremonies welcoming veterans home. Many soldiers had not just physical scars of the war, but also psychological ones as well, and many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). The Vietnam veterans also often fell into alcohol and drug abuse. Unfortunately, the government did not provide enough services to help the returning veterans readjust, so their psychological needs often went unmet. And so these are kind of these protests going on up here. And so you see the National Guard being called in, and you just see people either sitting, and some of these turn violent, but you'll see protesting going on because, like, hey, we don't like this war. We don't like how our government did this. You're supposed to work for us, not the other way around. The war hurt the military's image as well, since many Americans associated the unpopular war with the armed forces. Even some veterans criticized the war, forming a group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. U.S. soldiers in Vietnam had generally low morale, had sometimes troops even shot at their own officers, a practice called fragging, rather than following an order they considered unreasonably dangerous. In the 1970s, many military leaders wanted to pull the army out of Vietnam because it was hurting the military and its reputation so much so it's like this was so unpopular. The military's like, we just gotta get out. We gotta cut our losses, get out of here. Leaders in the U.S. Wait, let's see. Okay, as American soldiers took over much of the fighting, the South Vietnamese government and the military became a secondary importance. The conflict became more of an American war than a South Vietnamese one. Consequently, the morale and performance of the South Vietnamese soldiers dropped. Relations between the U.S. and the South Vietnamese troops began to deteriorate as some Americans became disgusted by what they saw as a lack of effort on the part of the South Vietnamese. Leaders in the U.S. government, including Johnson, did not always tell the truth about how badly the war was going or about changes in strategy. As the press began to find out and publish articles revealing these lies, as credibility gap began to emerge. So it's like we're just not trusting everyone. Many people took the attitude that you can't believe anything the government tells you. You kind of hear that today. And a large portion of the American public became cynical about the government in general. After the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, we'll talk about Watergate after this, many people used the word politician as a pejorative, which is a negative term. The U.S. used chemicals in Vietnam to defoliate jungle areas, and they denied food and to deny food to the Viet Cong, including the infamous Agent Orange. These chemicals caused illness among U.S. soldiers as well as the people of South Vietnam. The war took a tremendous psychological toll on President Johnson. The president seemed to age 20 years during 5 years as he in the White House. As he was in the White House, that usually happens to presidents. But if you look at Lincoln, if you look at FDR, if you look at, I'm trying to think other major war, Johnson, you see this rapid age. Like even Obama, like looks incredibly older from just 8 years. Let's see. American prestige diminished because the U.S. involved itself in a prolonged war that it did not win. The tragedy in Vietnam made many U.S. leaders more hesitant to involve the U.S. in other foreign conflicts, an attitude that some refer to as the Vietnam syndrome. So this is just like we don't want to get into another Vietnam, and everyone was kind of afraid of that. So, last little thing I think. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so there's 7 more pages. Let me get back. Okay, so this is the enemy's point of view. So, in making a decision, it can often be helpful to look at the situation from another point of view, especially from the perspective of one's enemy or opponent. This handout asks you to make decisions about the Vietnam conflict from the perspective of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. So now we're switching roles. So you're no longer American, you're now North Vietnamese. Let's see. Okay. Nothing important there. But you are Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnamese, and the U.S. may start a substantial bombing campaign against North Vietnam. So you need to bring in more air defense weapons to shoot down their planes. The Americans will focus on crippling the North Vietnamese economy. However, since North Vietnam doesn't have many factories, the Americans won't have a lot of targets to hit. They will probably focus on transportation, bombing railroad tracks, roads, bridges. They might also try to blockade Hai Phong, North Vietnam's only port, to prevent you from trading by sea. The Americans don't want to kill North Vietnamese citizens, so that might limit their bombing. For example, they most likely won't bomb the dams around Hanoi, since that would cause a flood that would kill tens of thousands of civilians. China and the Soviet Union have protected North Vietnam with aid, and they will probably give more in the future in order to weaken the United States. So, okay, for this, what action will you take to counteract the U.S. bombing in North Vietnam? Will you choose? You can choose as many options as you like. So you can choose all of these. So, but when you do choose them, make sure you explain why you choose them. So, number one, A, ask for more air defense weapons from China and the Soviet Union. B, move civilians near targets such as railroad tracks and airports, or place movable targets such as storage tanks or soldiers in civilian areas. C, make sure by scheduling deliveries and delaying ships from leaving that there are always foreign ships in the harbor in Hai Phong, so that if the Americans try to bomb the harbor, they would risk of hitting a ship from other countries. Also, if the U.S. tries to place mines in the harbor, this will prevent other countries' ships from leaving. Improve land transportation from China in case the U.S. mines the harbor at Hai Phong. Create repair brigades to fix bridges and other transportation. These groups will go out after a bombing and repair things as quickly as possible. F, send more North Vietnamese troops into South Vietnam. This will let the Americans know that if they bomb North Vietnam, you will step up your military attacks on South Vietnam. Or G, compromise with the United States. Tell them that North Vietnam will stop helping the Viet Cong if the U.S. stops bombing. I'm looking, and I'm actually going to leave this all to you. Make sure you just go through this and read it, because my voice is kind of going out. But this is just some good analysis. Make sure you do the questions of analysis and all this. And if you need me to make a video, I'll make it tomorrow. If you absolutely need me to, just make sure you comment on the video. So hopefully this helps. My voice is going out. It's getting a little rough because I've been doing a couple recordings before y'all's. So sorry that I couldn't really finish it, but hopefully this helps. Okay.